Welcome to the Expert Series, where we explore the issues shaping Canadian national security and defense. I'm Josh Mulm, Director of Research and Analysis for the CDA Institute. Today, our guest host, Daniel Araya, will be moderating a panel with Dr. Kurtis Simpson, Dan Ciuriak, Roberto Mazzolin, and Dr. Amos Fox. All of today's guests have something in common, that being that they all contributed to and wrote for the CDA Institute's latest on-track volume, edited by Mr. Araya, entitled National Security in the Age of AI and Robotics. This episode serves as a companion piece of sorts to the publication, and this discussion will build upon many of the issues, challenges, and themes included in our most recent on-track volume. In this episode, our guests will discuss AI and national security, defense modernization, space and cybersecurity, and NATO interoperability. This is the Expert Series.
Hello, my name is Daniel Araya, and I'm the guest editor for the latest volume of On Track, the official journal of the CDA Institute. In this podcast, we discuss national security in the age of artificial intelligence and robotics, exploring the evolving domains of machine learning, automation, and global security. Together, these technologies are redefining national security in ways that policymakers, military leaders, and technologists are still trying to understand. What are the risks of this new era? How should governments adapt? And what does this mean for the balance of power in the 21st century? I'm joined today by Dr. Kurtis Simpson, economist Dan Ciuriak, Dr. Roberto Mazzolin, and Dr. Amos Fox, all very highly accomplished experts in their respective fields. Together, we'll unpack key insights from their work and explore the critical questions facing defense institutions as AI and other emerging technologies shape security strategies for the future. So I thought before we get started, Kurtis, if you wouldn't mind just giving us a brief summary of your background, very brief, and then we'll move on to Dan, Rob, and Amos.
Okay, Daniel, thank you very much. Delighted to be here with this august panel. I am currently serving as a special advisor for Indo-Pacific Affairs with the Strategic Joint Staff at Department of National Defense. I'm a trained sinologist, senior defense scientist, and I worked across numerous government departments, the Privy Council Office, Foreign Affairs, as well as national defense and various intelligence organizations.
I had a 31-year career with the government of Canada, retiring as deputy chief economist, and have since moved into the think tank world. I focus on quantitative trade modeling and on the role of innovation in driving economies in this day of accelerated technological change. So that's me.
Rob, please.
Thanks very much, Sir Dan. My name is Rob Mazzolin, a former Canadian Forces military, ultimately responsible for Canadian Cyber Force operations, signals intelligence, electronic warfare operations. Did a stint at the United States Cyber Command as the Vice Director of Strategic Plans and Policy and Force Development and Training. And now the last 6 years I've served in industry and serve as a senior defense security space and cyber strategist for a multinational companies, Araya, Nexova, and Araya, based in Europe and Canada.
Amos.
All right, thanks Daniel, for having me as a part of this. I'm Amos Fox. I am currently a professor of practice at Arizona State University, where I work at the Future Security Initiative, managing editor of Small Wars Journal as part of that. And then I also work as a lecturer at the University of Houston in the Political Science Department, where I teach strategy and international relations and IR theory. And and I'm a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel. I was in the Army for 24 years, armor officer, so tanks, cavalry. Spent my whole career as an armor officer, so nothing exciting outside of being in the field and smelling tank exhaust for 24 years. So that's me. Back to you, Daniel. Thanks.
Fantastic. So I think, given your background, it's pretty obvious that you're the right people to speak to and understanding what's going on. We, together, the group of us put together this volume for On Track, and I think I encourage the audience to read the essays with some level of focus, because they're very informative and they come from a place of wisdom and intelligence. I'm going to ask a series of questions, hopefully to get the conversation started. to begin to extract from their writing and their work some understanding of what we're facing. So I'll begin with Kurtis, if you don't mind. In your piece, Militarizing AI, How to Catch the Digital Dragon, you examine and define the ongoing militarization of AI. What are the three waves of AI that you mentioned, and how is AI reshaping the world's most advanced militaries today?
I think when you understand AI, you really do have to understand it in three kind of distinct stages of evolution. The first wave of AI is defined as being knowledge-based, which relies on rules-based decision-making, facilitating automation. And in short, it draws on expert human knowledge and a number of if-then statements to dictate actions. An example of this would be a difficult logistical problem, such as the processing of thousands of shipping containers in a large port, where all the parameters can be defined and inputted, and the AI can execute decisions within this context. Therefore, it enables processing over very narrowly defined domains. So if that's the first wave, the second wave builds on probabilistic methods or statistical learning and big data. Examples here would be voice and face recognition. These models are trained on specific data and can get good at classification and prediction, but not contextualization or reasoning. The third wave really is where we are now, and it aims to produce contextual adaptation. It'll be able to understand context, leverage that contextual understanding for common sense reasoning, and adjust to changing circumstances. It's more a merging of the human-machine interface. This type of AI enables improved reasoning skills as well as adaptation to new tasks and situations, as well as improved real-world interaction as AI systems merge with that human-level cognition. I think really, if you had to understand it in a really, really simple way, the three evolutionary waves are best summarized as describe, categorize, and explain. Now, if you apply that to the world's militaries, AI is shaping global militaries in fundamental ways by first improving operational efficiency, second, facilitating autonomy, and third, fielding new capabilities. In my paper, I talk about 8 such capabilities, such as command and control, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, simulation, and training. I won't get into all of them here, but that gives you an example. And essentially, AI enables the processing of endless volumes of data with unprecedented speed, therefore improving the quality and the accuracy of decision-making, which offers decisive advantage in deterring an adversary or winning a conflict.
Fantastic. There's so many dimensions to this. One aspect that I think, particularly in security studies, isn't always highlighted is the economics of AI and how it's changing the global order. Dan, in your essay, Military Modernization and the Age of Machine Knowledge Capital, you suggest that the peace dividend that Canada has enjoyed is no more. Could you say something about what has changed, and what do you mean by machine knowledge capital?
Sure. Thanks, Daniel. The world has become definitely a more dangerous place for many reasons. And one of them was because of the evolution of technology, which Kurtis just described. We see now the reemergence of great power rivalry due to China's technological convergence to the U.S.-dominated technology frontier, which has triggered major strategic moves globally in the economic and geopolitical sphere. Think of just the Belt and Road Initiative from China, the emergence of the BRICS as a geopolitical forum. We also have now the uncertainty bomb dropped by the United States in terms of its geopolitical stance, which has weakened the external constraints on international violence. The last helicopter out of Kabul was 6 months before Putin moved big time on Ukraine, just to put the two things in context. We also see that the Arctic is not so frozen anymore. This used to be an impassable frontier. Now it is a geopolitical bone of contention. The United States is not so friendly anymore and seemingly wishes to align with Russia, which is on the other side of our northern frontier. And this is decidedly uncomfortable for Canada. And unlike historically, Canada cannot rely on another superpower to counterbalance. We used to be a part of the British Empire, and that is no longer a thing for us. Great Britain is a shadow of its former self. So the peace dividend that Canada enjoyed for decades is just no more. We're no longer a junior partner in an unassailable fortress North America, and we have to both ramp up our defense capabilities, but we also have to do it at a time when we are at a time of massive technological change in a context where we are lagging in innovation performance. And this technological change is both redefining the military arts, as Kurtis described, and is disrupting the basis of economic security, which means that Canada now faces a daunting dual task of substantially improving its defense capability while also dealing with the issue of ensuring our economic security in a context where we are actually now under threat from coercive U.S. tariff measures. So from Canada's perspective, we're in a much more dangerous place. And here I would highlight the issue of machine knowledge capital, which you asked about, Daniel. So economic ages tend to be defined by the emergence of new forms of productive capital. When a new form enters, everything changes. We've gone from historically an agrarian age when land was king to an industrial era when the machinery of mass production was king to the era of knowledge-based economies when in fact technology, disembodied technology in the form of patents was capturing all the economic rent, to then when data dominated starting around 2010. And now we're entering a new era when AI, or in the form of machine knowledge capital, a new form of productive asset, is going to be reshaping economies. The issues are pervasive because everything changes. Economics, society, wealth distribution, the locus of wealth, where it's located, politics, geopolitics, everything changes. And importantly, the front runners of one economic era have not tended to be the front runners in the next. And that's where you get the geopolitical rivalry issue emerging. China joined the data-driven economy when data assumed a disproportionately large role in shaping economies contemporaneously with the United States, but with a scale advantage which offset its lagging technological capability. And as regards to entering the age of machine knowledge capital, when generative AI is reshaping the production function, it's almost at a par with the United States as we see from the DeepSeek phenomenon. So what we know is that at this particular point in time, the world will change in fundamental ways that we cannot fully anticipate, and we find ourselves a challenge of both modernizing our defense capability, but for a defense situation that is very difficult to perceive in the context, as I said, of this new emerging great power rivalry. So that is the essence of my piece.
Thanks, Dan. I think there's a lot of value in that too, because it helps to understand why we're undergoing so many changes in what seems like the blink of an eye after many decades of what seemed like basic stasis. And I think, at the tip of the spear, so to speak, is security. And I worry that we really don't know where this is going, to say the least. Rob, in your piece, you highlight the two domains of space and cyber. And I know you're an expert in this area. Could you give us some understanding of the scale and scope of change that you see coming down the pipe?
Well, thanks very much, Dan. I'd say in large part the big impact really is the democratization of the access to space, the space exploration and the research that goes beyond government agencies now to commercially financed and operated launches and systems. And this has particular importance when you consider that space and cyber have now become new domains of warfare. Today's AI enables a whole scope and breadth of capabilities that maybe 10 years ago wouldn't have even been anticipated or understood. The ability in space now to continuously monitor assets and debris in real time, anticipate trajectories. All this contributes to space domain awareness, space situational awareness. Also, it's fostered a whole new competitive array of space and counter space operations. And as well, the AI has facilitated a whole range of downstream space applications that impact terrestrial capabilities. Weather forecasting, agriculture, urban planning, environmental monitoring, which tie right into ISR-based capabilities. And these have all contribute to both military and geopolitical interests. So when we consider that the barrier of entry to space exploration and its utilizations have significantly been reduced, and this enables a broader list of participants to engage in space. So it's no longer the domain of major actors. In the cyber area, again, this democratization enhances mission efficiency. It also broadens the participation, but also introduces a range of complex cybersecurity challenges to space-based assets that are central to both national security as well as interstate competition. When we look at virtually every aspect of our society is dependent on space to some degree in the areas of position, navigation, and timing, communications, and Earth and space observation. So for each benefit that AI generates, there's an equal risk of attack, infiltration, and compromise. And AI can generate adaptive malware capabilities that can evade even the most sophisticated defenses. So you can train AI to defend from past compromises, but at the same time, you can also train it to learn from past defensive capabilities and escalate the nature of and the sophistication of attacks. And this spirals into an escalating cyber contribution or competition. So the future is characterized by the intersection of AI, cyber, and space. And although it holds promise for resilience, innovation, and security, it also creates opportunities for adversaries to disrupt without significant infrastructure investment. And these benefits can be countered by added costs of defense, as adversaries launch attacks and both pre and post-launch. The future of space and cyber intelligence is another area that becomes extremely important. Who masters the AI environment is going to determine who leads and who lags. The rapid pace of technology change is reshaping the battlefield landscape. AI is no longer simply a data processing tool, but it's evolved into an autonomous system that's capable of real-time decision-making and continuous learning and fundamentally transforming the nature of space and cyber operations. As AI technology evolves, nations have to really rethink their development processes to stay ahead. As battlefield operations and doctrine evolve overnight, this emphasizes the need to develop more agile, adaptive strategies that enable the integration of AI into operational systems. So this requires a forward-thinking approach to development that involves integration of an industry base with government and integrating a rapid adaptation and seamless deployment of AI across defensive applications. So ultimately, the integration of AI into both offensive and defensive space and cyber operations is going to determine who's dominant.
Yes, that's scary. So you mentioned the battlefield. So Amos, in your piece, Strategic Interoperability in the Age of AI and Robotics, you highlight the Ukraine war and the leveraging of AI and drones. What do you think we're learning from the Ukraine war about the future of the battlefield?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things come to the fore when I look at Ukraine. First off, drone. I'm going to be the fly in the ointment a little bit, but drones aren't the silver bullet, the end all be all. If anything, at least as they're currently employed, they've slowed down the conflict and elongated the conflict, and arguably have helped create the stalemate, or at least contribute to the stalemate that we see in Ukraine today. And so there's a lot of hope and a lot of hype put into drones, but they don't really deliver anything that would be considered decisive in the traditional sense of the term. And so I think that that's something that we have to consider when we think about drones and the evolution of drones. And a couple of other points on that too that also come out of the conflict is that drones don't carry significant payload, and ones that do carry, relatively big shots of payload only carry a small number. And so their ability to inflict any kind of major significant battlefield loss at this point is not all that great. Now, they are great for assisting in targeting, that's for sure. But again, targeting alone doesn't solve the problem of land wars, right? And so most wars are actually land wars, as much as we don't want to say it. And there's a fundamental problem with drones that you see in Ukraine as it relates to land wars, and that is they don't land on the ground and clear Russians out of bunkers and out of trench lines and out of buildings that they're hiding in, right? And so that's a severe limitation, and I think that's something that's not getting enough play, is that drones can't hold territory. They can't prevent counterattacks from territory being retaken. And so they are an auxiliary element to forces fighting on the ground. And at the end of the day, again, I'm making up a number here, but 9 times out of 10, most wars are land wars fought for something on the ground. And so that to me is the big takeaway. And as it relates to just the last couple things here, the other thing with that is, the loss of robotics, the loss of drones, the loss of things that aren't flesh and blood, that has a different value as it relates to the loss of human beings. And so we have to understand that, you can see states and non-state actors throw drones at a problem all day long until they run out of money. But at the end of the day, like when all the drones or all the robotics, all the cool things that aren't human beings that are destroyed, and a state hasn't accomplished their policy aims, then it's probably going to be Operation Human Wave right on the back end of that. So we can't think that drones are going to solve all the problems of manpower in the future. The other point with that, similarly, is the drones, again, aren't the wonder weapon of the future. And they're auxiliary tools, so we shouldn't put all our eggs in that basket of hope. And then lastly, as it relates to, I say this as I don't know if I'm the token American here. I don't know what everybody else's nationality is, but NATO's important. I just want an American to make sure they say that. And is with that in mind, interoperability amongst the alliance is important. And so we have to make sure that, like for the U.S. in particular, we're not rushing so far ahead that our partners can't keep up, and that we're unwilling to, make up the difference if we do rush too far ahead in terms of developing AI and systems that run off of these types of things, and semi-autonomous systems and human-machine integrated formations. And so as we think about the future of this, especially as it relates to the alliance, we have to keep that interoperability piece at the fore of our minds. Back over to you, Daniel.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Amos. You are the token American, unfortunately, but you're among friends. And I would say, as you point out in your piece on it, the focus being interoperability, that's really the key to waging and winning wars. And I take your point. I think we all do that. In the end, it's going to be manpower that holds ground. But I wonder, and I'm going to turn this question to Kurtis. If you look at Canada, for example, we're just so far behind, I think, in investments in the military. If we were to focus more of our GDP on spending on security, and we were to build a more advanced, more sophisticated defense industrial base, which is something you highlight in your piece, what would that look like? I mean, for example, how can we persuade? I mean, maybe it's easier now, and with the frictions with the United States, with the Trump administration. How do we begin to bridge the differences between Canadians' understanding of the need for security and the public and private sectors collaborating to produce, common ends? It might be a convoluted question, but I hope you understand what I mean.
No, and I think it's important. And from my perspective, public-private partnership is a critical next step in addressing the AI challenge. And this really involves uniting two domains, procurement and innovation. Now, defense procurement is often criticized for being slow, prone to cost overruns, risk-adverse, lacking transparency, and more concerned with process than outcomes. And this type of approach doesn't lend itself to AI's accelerated developmental pace. I think when you look at defense innovation, we've had some advances there, things like the stand-up of the IDEAS program in Canada, which stands for Innovation for Defense Excellence and Security, and that entails a $1.6 billion investment in innovation for defense and security over the next 20 years. It mobilizes Canadian innovators through defense and security challenges and gets them to collaborate, adapt, and shape defense problems in a very much more inclusive and outreach kind of model. But really, when it comes down to it, the challenge to me is we have a very dynamic Canadian private sector in AI, a national program and clusters of excellence. We have exceptional universities doing groundbreaking research. And we have several national labs, national government labs like Defense Research and Development Canada and the National Research Council. But all of them still seem to exist within silos. And we need a new model that clusters these interests together in some type of shared space. And when you imagine this, usually the example that's cited is the US's Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, or DARPA. And this came about in the early days of the space race. And DARPA makes pivotal investments in breakthrough technologies for national security. And in so doing, DARPA explicitly reaches for transformational change versus incremental advances. And when you look at this, the UK has created its own version of DARPA with the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, and Australia is considering the stand-up of something very similar called the Advanced Strategic Research Agency. From my perspective, what Canada needs is its own version of this to model and institutionalize a dynamic innovation environment that weds industry, academia, and government together in a rapid turnover, risk-tolerant, non-bureaucratic, experimental milieu that would really help us enable real-time innovation and bring industry, academia, and government together in common cause. And I think if you look at something like the successes of DARPA in the States, they're as profound as GPS, weather satellites, drones, and stealth technology. So when I look at models that we should emulate and adapt, I do think that the DARPA model in the States, as it's being transformed in the UK and Australia, would be perfect for Canada, and would also enable us to further develop our partnerships like the AUKUS trilateral partnership that has a very important S&T domain to it, and it would be a great entry point for Canada.
Well, I think you're preaching to the choir on that. I couldn't agree more. I've written actually on that subject matter on DARPA and the need for more risk tolerance in Canada, not just in technology specifically, but in technologies that can leverage security, or at least have some advantage to leveraging security development. So, Dan, I know you have a lot to say on this subject matter as well, and I think you frame it in terms of the data economy or machine knowledge capital. How would, let's say we just talk about procurement, how would procurement change in an era of machine knowledge capital, knowing that Canada's behind, let's say, on security investment and development?
So yeah, military procurement is definitely changing. But let me just kind of start with the observation that Mark Rutte just made recently at in Europe at the NATO conference. He said, "We are not yet at war, but we are no longer at peace." And 2% today is not meaningful. This was a peacetime figure. It needs to be upped seriously and immediately. Poland has just upped its target to 6% of GDP. So the question then comes, how do we pay for this? And since Canada is not an industrial heavyweight, we can't produce all of this stuff ourselves and mobilize, our industry to generate the military assets that we require. But we can be a tech heavyweight. And in the era of machine knowledge capital, we are in fact leaders. We have been a forerunner in developing AI systems. Many of the technologies that made Google great came from Canada. Quantum AI is something which Canada has also been a leader in. So we focus on tech. Now, less than marry the issue of technology and military procurement. So, and that leads us directly to military civilian fusion. We need to focus on the technology part of that, which is dual use, and that's the one that expands our defense contribution while building the companies that generate the GDP that pays for defense. Now, as was just said, DARPA is a phenomenal model for developing technology. The reason why it succeeds is because it builds firms. All GDP pretty much is inside a firm. And also, if you think about national security in terms of the technological capabilities, it also resides in firms. Okay, so if we build our firms, we're both building GDP and we're building national security capability. And so as a small open economy that depends on trade, Canada has to focus on its comparative advantage. And right now, our comparative advantage is not going to be in building the heavy industrial assets that the military needs, but in doing things like cybersecurity and secure comms. So we do need the drones and hulls, but maybe Korea builds those better than we do. What we should focus on is the things that we have got an advantage on. That then enables us to build firms which supply that technology not only for our own military but to our ally system, and then we then are able to make our contribution. And we, as I said, we need to really up that contribution dramatically right now, and we have to focus on what we do well. So that's kind of my take on this.
So I want to circle back to that again because I think it's worth an effort to drill down into what that would look like in some level of detail for an audience that may not really appreciate or understand or, let's say, value the minutia of industrial policy. But before we get to that, I'm going to ask Rob, as a former military officer, I think you could speak with some authority on, let me frame it differently. I think a lot of people are worried that these technologies are driving a new Cold War, and that, if that's avoidable, it should be avoided. Is there some, in your piece towards the end of it, you highlight the value of cooperation between major powers, and I think by that you meant not necessarily being best friends, but at least having a working understanding or maybe a framework for some mutual respect, let's say. Is there more effort that we can make, beyond security alone to ensure that that this doesn't become, a hot war on a global level?
Thank you, Dan. In short, yes, and I think it harkens back to historical experience whenever a technological change has been introduced into a contemporary conflict and requiring nations to really reflect on the nature of the potential impact of the technology and the nature of conflict on their respective ways of life and global security. I think it's important to start, at the beginning when you look at an arms race and from an AI perspective, it refers to the competition between nations to develop and deploy cutting edge AI technologies, for both economic and military advantage. And unlike traditional military buildups, this race is driven by rapid advancements in machine learning, generative AI, and semiconductor manufacturing. And these are all dual-use technologies. These technologies are revolutionizing industrial capabilities ranging from transportation to healthcare. They create wealth and economic opportunity. So there's that whole dimension to international competition. And given that commercial players are central to the respective protagonist development, and more specifically the U.S. and China, the struggle for leadership has geopolitical implications, as China and U.S. compete for strategic advantage both at home and internationally. Now, you have a number of other players that are starting to offer different perspectives. The European Union has tried to lead from a regulatory perspective, in the development of their AI Act. It really speaks to ethical standards in the application of artificial intelligence. You see recent collaboration on the part of Korea and Japan to highlight strategic partnerships, and a lot of that, and here focusing on the developing on artificial intelligence chips and quantum computing, and a lot of this represents a shift away from dependency on Chinese or U.S. technologies. India, among others, are emerging as second-tier players and developing their AI capabilities, largely for societal interests, but certainly closely tied to their military capabilities. So a lot of these alliances are starting to serve to counterbalance the dominance of the major powerhouses. Corporate actors are playing an influential role in global AI competition, and they're intertwined with national strategies. So the issue here arises with respect to ethical standards, not only in the application of the technologies to civil environments, but also military environments. And it's probably really highlighted, when you look at military applications of AI, such as those that are being developed by Russia. And this further intensifies AI competition because largely those are very much focused in the military environment. So this development emphasizes the crucial intersection of AI with national security and defense strategies globally. It raises concerns about the ethical implications and the long-term consequences of AI militarization, as we see that in many cases, the rapid development of AI capabilities, although very useful in many routine decision-making processes when it comes to the ethical implications associated with lethal autonomous weapon systems. And I extend this in the space and cyber environments because many of these capabilities have fundamental impacts on the decision-making processes of operations in those environments that impact critical infrastructure, that impact ISR strategic decision-making at a national level. So the AI arms race is fraught with risks from, data privacy, AI safety, and widening, technological disparities across these countries. So it needs really careful management. Now, my principal concern comes in the area of ethics. We've seen over the last 20 years, democracies declined, and now the main commodity appears to be, raw power and authoritarian leadership among the major powers, and they often override the interests of lesser nations. So we've moved away from a systems environment where we had multinational institutions that spoke and looked to rationalize capabilities and establish a dialogue so that intent and unintended consequences were mitigated between major players. So now we're moving into more of an incentives-based competition. So the risk, in my mind, for unintended consequences is very great, given that AI and lethal systems isn't yet advanced enough to be fully trusted. And given that the ethical basis upon which decisions are made is not normalized between major players, we see, we're looking at the major players, the fundamental social, ethical, moral calculus is fundamentally different. And so I think it's important to reenact capabilities or dialogue between major players. So intent is fully understood, and capabilities, the nature of the capabilities and their impacts are normalized and rationalized. And so it harkens back to discussions that took place in the establishment of the Geneva Conventions. And I think a model along those lines that requires major players internationally and also lesser players to be involved in a dialogue that helps normalize a regulatory environment and engagement for the benefit of all.
Yeah, well, let's hear on that. I hope that comes along. Amos, I kind of want to, so the basic question I have for you is around interoperability, but, and as it overlaps NATO, but as we see from the recent Munich conference, I think there's some debate about whether NATO is going to survive over the long term. It looks to me like the U.S. is changing tack geostrategically, sees less value, I think, or less need for worrying about Europe, and obviously wants some sort of deal with Russia, and is focusing much more attention on China and the rise of Asia, which, I think is perfectly realistic. I don't think that thinking is mistaken. But my question, I guess, would be, what do you think of all this? Where do you think the U.S. is going with regard to geostrategy and security?
So that's a tough one because again, this is just my own personal assessment, but I think that there's a lot of bluffing going on right now from DC as it relates to a lot of these issues that we see going on with Mexico. When I say we, I mean the U.S. With U.S.-Mexico relations, U.S.-Canada relations, and then what's going on with NATO and what's going on in Europe, I think might be a little less of a bluff. For whatever reason, we find it like the stuff that's gone on the past couple of days with the whole, trying to wrap the war up quickly. It seems completely illogical to me because if you think about this in the bigger sense of the question, what is I guess it depends on how you want to frame it, but what's worse for Russia? Is getting out of the war worse for Russia or keeping Russia engaged in the war worse for Russia? And then asking that question as it relates to European security. Certainly, it's not good for Ukraine to keep Russia engaged in that conflict. However, it does keep them occupied, tied down, losing resources. You talked about economics a bit earlier, right? It hurts Russia economically. It hurts Russia domestically. I'm not one of those people that, that says Russia's always on the verge of economic collapse. We've been hearing that since day 3 of the conflict, right? And we're at day whatever 3 years is. So I've never bought into that. I think Russia's economy is just different. And I think Russian people are just a bit different, and they can suffer hardships in ways that many of us in the West and the U.S. in particular are not accustomed to suffering. And they'll endure things that we probably would not endure in the same way. And so, as we look at that relationship, I think if you're trying to keep Russia down, keeping the and I know it sounds cynical and kind of harsh, but keeping the conflict going, obviously at the expense of Ukraine, unfortunately, that's bigger and better and probably more beneficial for European security. But this is the wild card part of the equation. We, the U.S., up until a couple of weeks ago, seemed like we used to care about European security, and maybe now we don't. And so this is why I can't. It's too early, I think, to put a finger on it, at least for me. But as I've watched so far the Trump administration, it seems to me there's a lot more bluffing and bluster as it relates to a lot of the things that it's doing in the U.S. Border region, so with the U.S. and Canada. But there's some pretty drastic things, I think, on the horizon as it relates to Europe and European security. And then the China piece, that as somebody that retired from the Army last year, and I spent 24 years in the Army, doing the normal tanker armor officer career. The China focus has come back again, and it was, China up until Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. And then it quickly reoriented, even though MDO, the multi-domain operations doctrine, did account for Russia to a degree. But I don't know. I think that one's more just, as silly as it may sound, I think people in the White House, the Pentagon, DC now are just tired of talking about Russia and dealing with Russia. So China's the next new shiny object. Because terrorism isn't the hot thing anymore. We've kind of kept that down for the past several years. Nobody wants to go back and do another Iraq or Afghanistan. I know, having spent 3 years of my life in Iraq, I certainly wouldn't want to go back and do that again either. And so I think that's potentially the focus shift, and why there's a lot of, as everybody's favorite Secretary of Defense said, with this, there's a lot of unknown unknowns, and the why behind what the U.S. is doing with Russia, Ukraine right now, and, why it's potentially short-circuiting NATO. again, why would you pick a fight with Denmark? Denmark's been in NATO since day one. It makes no sense. And so there's a lot of unknowns, and I think they may come to the fore as time moves forward, but I don't know. So I didn't give you a good answer because I think I'm probably just as confused as everybody else. I have some other opinions, but I'll keep those to myself for the time being. But that's, I know I didn't give you a good answer, but there you go.
No, that's not the case. I think we're all a little bewildered, and there's a lot of speculation about where this is all going. So in a way, I kind of surprised you with that, but I was curious about your reaction because I think we're all, wondering where this is all going. We're clearly at a pivot point in history. I know Dan has got a lot to say. Hold on, Dan, before you jump into that, I want to frame the question so that you can add something with regard to the data economy. So I was hoping maybe you and Kurtis together could discuss how we can upgrade the defense environment in Canada in a way that is cost-effective, smart, strategic. You point out that we should be focusing on what Canada does well, which is more at the high end of the value chain. And Kurtis mentioned DARPA. I know there has been speculation even within the Trudeau administration, Trudeau government about Canadian DARPA. Is that something you would be inclined to support as well? This is to Dan, and then Kurtis, if you could jump in, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. So let me just kind of preface my remarks by saying, we have to be prepared to fight the wars of of every single age of humanity. If you think about Canada's war with Spain over fishing rights up the Grand Banks, that was hunter-gatherer era warfare. Who controls territory where you sort of harvest things from the sea? We have been fighting land wars, which are Lebensraum wars in the Middle East. We have been fighting over the basic resources for the industrial economy, including land wars in Ukraine. Russia's target has been the critical minerals in the Donbass area, for example. We have been fighting over data. This is now not kinetic war, but it's in virtual space, enclosing digital spaces to control data. And if you think about the U.S. Connected Cars initiative, right, which basically bars Chinese connected cars being in the U.S., it's because of all the data that is streaming from those cars into the cloud. And now we are in this new age of AI. This is, again, a non-kinetic war that is being fought over technology, but one which could actually play a decisive advantage in kinetic wars if we were to engage them. But basically, we are fighting across the spectrum in all the ages of humanity, and we have to be cognizant of that particular dimension of the defense requirement. And if you think about what connects Greenland, the focus on Canada's annexation in certain comments from President Trump, and the current situation in the Arctic. Well, the Arctic is at risk of becoming a China-Russia lake because the passage along the Siberian coast is the one that's most open, and China's got a polar Silk Road. So if you connect Greenland, Canada's north, and Alaska, then you have a contiguous area of U.S. territory, which then is critical for a face-off with Russia, China in that new era, in a new area of geopolitical contest. So that kind of makes sense. I'm not saying that's exactly what's driving all those comments, but one can certainly rationalize it in that fashion. The critical point, though, that you raised, Daniel, is then sort of, how do we actually sort of move forward in the area of our comparative advantage, given this context that we have to be able to actually fight in all these different eras. And in terms of the DARPA model, the critical thing to focus on is that it transfers or it allows companies to develop new technologies, which then become their private assets, and which they can then use to grow their business and develop all kinds of adjacent models or adjacent products. the U.S. innovation system is unique for military development because of the DARPA thing, because of its connectedness. It connects the companies. It can with the users of the technology in a way, and with the university systems, which help to provide a lot of the technological input, and that nexus then drives that innovation capability, which has made the U.S. unique. Now, if we were to follow that model, what I emphasize is the need to focus on firms. Is if we were, for example, to try and do something similar, we would then allocate procurement to any number of Canadian firms that have got interesting technologies that would have dual use capabilities that would be able to be developed to both service our military and, as I said, to export to our allies, but that would also then build civilian capabilities that would drive our economy. And just to give you an example of a simple-minded example, we had allocated $28 billion for development of EVs. All of this was flowing to a handful of foreign multinationals. It hasn't worked out. It's been a total bust. But if we had taken that $28 billion and seeded $1 billion per company, we would have 28 unicorns. And those unicorns would be the future drivers of the Canadian economy. To give you a statistic, which is really meaningful for Canada, okay, we normally consider ourselves to be 1/10 the size of the U.S. and everything. So where the U.S. has got 130 global 500 firms, we've got 12. It's 1 to 10 pretty much. But in unicorns, the U.S. has over 800 and we have 20. And that is a huge, huge gap. And that identifies the main source of all of our economic problems. So if we can use our military procurement to both drive the development of military technologies that are going to keep our military and the military of our allies secure in this coming world, but also develop our economy, then that would be the way to go. So focus on the firm.
Yeah, I want to circle back to that as well, because I have some thoughts with regard to how the Canadian economy and U.S. economies will interact over time. I mean, it seems like everything's changing. I think the U.S. is going to expect a lot more in whatever replaces USMCA. But Kurtis, what are you thinking of what Dan's saying? I guess my question would be, why haven't we done something like this already? And I assume the answer is just that Canada hasn't needed to. We've been able to rely on the U.S. security umbrella, but it seems like for reasons of sovereignty, if nothing else, we're going to have to start thinking with a little bit more effort about how we secure ourselves.
Yeah, and I think that is a critical point, that the new U.S. administration reinforces our responsibility to defense and security, and I think that's going to help in redefining how we understand our national interests. When it actually comes to defense and preparedness, I think my suggestion is that we have to really develop niche capabilities. We should focus on select industries, technologies, and capabilities, as well as geographic areas like the Arctic, and give up trying to be all things to all people at all times, and really have that niche expertise in critical areas and define our value added as being different, but being exceptional in a limited number of areas. And I think that's how we truly market ourselves as a value-added partner.
So I was hoping maybe, Rob, I could ask you this, and maybe Amos has some opinions about this as well. It looks like on the surface that the U.S.-Canada relationship is troubled, and I assume that's really just because we're entering a new geopolitical environment, and I think Trump is feeling out what to do with the Trump administration more broadly. He's feeling out what to do about all the dependencies, the security dependencies surrounding him and economic dependencies. And I think we could certainly pull our weight more than we have. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, do either of you have opinions on, well, let's just start with Rob first. What do you think, if you were to forecast where this is going, what do you think the U.S.-Canada relationship will look like in 10 years in security terms? I mean, I assume we'll still have that. But what is your opinion?
My sense is that, if you look historically at the Canada-U.S. relationship, throughout the history from even before Confederation, I mean, there's always been, peaks and troughs. But I think the enduring priority will always be, the security of continental North America. And I'd say that is one area that I think we can certainly pull our weight, even more so. I mean, the issue of underspending in defense, it's not news to other folks. And I think there's, the recent political events have really drawn attention to that. And again, when we start looking at, an increasingly multipolar world, where major strategic powers are looking to assert themselves globally to a different extent, it becomes clear that the major power, when we look at a free, liberal, democratic West, in terms of how we look to protect our sovereign interests, the interests that are shared by like-minded nations, there's a division of labor that needs to be undertaken. And, the issue of the U.S. pivot was something that was very topical in, 10, 15 years ago. And the major strategic threat had been acknowledged to be China. And I think that's where, in the context of stretched resources, defense resources, is where they're looking to do. So I think the request or the hope is that other players, do their bit, in the rest of the globe. So, certainly the call for the Europeans to become more engaged as it speaks to, the MENA, Eastern Europe, likely, well placed. For us in Canada, as we look at, an increasingly bellicose Russia, that becomes important. But I'd say, underpinning this and kind of trying to draw back to, comments that Dan and Kurtis made when we take a look at technology, and artificial intelligence. Again, when we take a look at the nature of intelligence and the fundamental import that artificial intelligence provides to, contemporary and the future military conflict, and its intrinsic tie with civil capabilities and geopolitical competition, economic competition, I think this is where the strength in a North American market becomes increasingly important. So I'd like to think I'm quite hopeful. I'd like to think that again there'll be a continued reinforced engagement between certainly our two militaries, our two countries. I think the Five Eyes intelligence sharing environment is extremely strong, and that's something that has stood the test of time, notwithstanding geopolitical challenges, and the opportunities that present themselves when we look at the dual scope of the AUKUS agreement. We start looking at how nations of like mind and values can participate in such a relationship. I think that Canada has a significant role to play, and the wake up call to invest more and do so in a way that is also economically beneficial, not only militarily beneficial. I mean, the technology, the strengths we have in that environment, I think offer interesting opportunities. So it's no longer solely a discussion of swords versus plowshares, but something that developing an enhanced capability that serves to enhance the security in its broadest sense in Canada and North America, and then by extension also across the Atlantic with other nations, and as well offering opportunities when we look at socializing with an emerging Africa, South America, unique opportunities there.
So Amos, I think it would be a mistake not to get your take as an American and a former military officer about where you see. I know you're personally a little skeptical about emerging technologies as being a little bit overhyped, and I appreciate that. But where do you see the U.S. military going as it tries to leverage these technologies? I mean, do you think that the U.S. military and its larger security industrial defense system is just going to pull ahead of the rest, and it'll be just U.S. versus China at the top end of the leaderboard, or how do you see this going?
Yeah, so before retiring, I spent the last 3 years of my career working at Army Futures Command, and I worked in the Director of Concepts. And so I specifically was on the team of 4 people that were working on the Army Warfighting Concept for 2040. And so, I looked at this problem every day and helped develop the ideas. The concept still hasn't come out. I'm going to make a joke that may not resonate, but I'm going to make it anyway because I think it's funny. But I always equate the Army Warfighting Concept of 2040 that AFC, Army Futures Command, is working on with Guns N' Roses' Chinese Democracy album, which took them 20 years to produce. And when it came out, it wasn't all that great. So I kind of feel like the Army Warfighting Concept for 2040 is in the same boat. Now, I say all that to say, what I saw when I worked there was that industry is driving the concept. Reality is not driving the concept. And so industry says, hey, Army Futures Command, we have all these things we could make for you. And then Army Futures Command says, hey, frame this concept in the context of these new capabilities, not necessarily of what the reality of armed conflict is. And so I think you see, I think it was about a year ago, February of 2024, the U.S. Army issued a white paper that outlined cuts to force structure and modifications to force structure, because right now at least in that time, 2024, the U.S. Army was in a zero-sum game as it related to force structure modifications. And so they had to gut significant portions of the land force to create room to build out these multi-domain task forces that the Army is standing up. And so there's going to be 5, or there are 5, or 5 are in the works. I don't know the current status of all of them, but 2 of them are dedicated to the Pacific. And then there's 1 in Europe, 1 in the Middle East, and then 1, I don't remember where the others. I think Indo-PACOM was the only combatant command with 2 of these. So I say that to say the Army seems to be gutting its land force to create these multi-domain task forces, because I don't want to say it's putting all of its eggs in that basket, and I know I've used that phrase twice now, so I won't say it again. But the Army seems to be buying in, whether because it's being led by industry or because it truly believes in it, that land forces, the forces that actually do the fighting on the ground, the security on the ground, are going to be less important on a future battlefield. And so we're I think over-investing in long-range precision strike and all sorts of other stuff that can help identify targets from really far away and shoot things one at a time. But again, going back to the point, okay, let's look at the threat. So what the threat of China that the U.S. is framing is related to Taiwan and Taiwan's sovereignty. At the end of the day, that's still going to be a land fight, right? If China ends up taking control of Taiwan, you're still going to have to go in there, whether it's the U.S., which probably wouldn't be the case, or the Taiwanese. It's still going to be a land fight. And so you should not be over-investing in things that can't fight and win in land wars. And again, precision strike, all these great things like HIMARS and ATACMS and GIMLRs and MLRS, all these different variations of the same thing. They're terrific at being fired, hitting things precisely, but the reality is that when you get attacked from above, you go underground or you go indoors, you hide from the explosive effects. So, you may get great effects on the first salvo of a strike, but after that, the effects of those strikes are going to quickly start dissipating. And then you're just going to be spending a lot of money on these munitions, firing these munitions, not killing a lot of people that need to be killed. And at the end of the day, you're still going to have to commit land forces to go in there and root out the people that are occupying the space that needs to be liberated. And so for me, that's where my thinking is. Again, if you look at the problem in Russia, Ukraine, the problem isn't the lack of precision strike, HIMARS, GIMLRs, ATACMS, this or that. It's that Russians are sitting on the ground in Ukraine, and Ukraine doesn't have sufficient manpower to go in and dig those guys out. And so I think that's really the concern when I look at the future and how the U.S. in particular is thinking about the future. And by virtue of the U.S. thinking about it that way, NATO and all our friends and allies and partners, at least right now, follow suit because, not to sound arrogant, but the U.S., leads the West as it relates to all that. And so if we misframe the problem, which I fear we might be doing, then the West is going to be misframed for future conflict. And that, to me, is where I find the rub between a lot of the hype. I call it hype. I think it's hype surrounding a lot of the futuristic things that people talk about when it relates to, warfare in 10 years. It's still going to be, this is a continuity that hasn't gone away. It requires people on the ground, killing other people on the ground at close range in areas that weapons that blow up from on top can't appropriately affect.
Well, on that cheery note, thanks, Amos.
You're welcome.
So I think we've had an hour at this, and I imagine people are pretty tired. Let's wind this down. And as we exit, I'd appreciate it if each one of you maybe had a closing comment, either on your own paper or on your thoughts on subject matter that we've discussed, obviously, particularly on AI and robotics, maybe beginning with Kurtis, and then Dan, and then Rob, and Amos. Thank you.
Thank you. I think if I had to have one kind of closing takeaway point, it would be the fact that when you look at emerging and disruptive technologies, the PRC now leads the world in 57 of 64 critical technologies. President Xi Jinping sees the main battlefield as being related to science and technology, and the Chinese R&D budget, which is predominantly military in many respects, is now at $458.5 billion annually. So I think really when we understand conflict and future scenarios, we have to really, really be focusing on the fact that the nexus and the locus of where S&T innovation has happened has shifted very much in many respects to the Indo-Pacific, and it's only accelerating, and that has to inform our thinking and our planning and our preparation.
Fantastic. Dan, please.
So, I think the key word I would leave you with is scalability. AI as a form of capital is eminently scalable because once you create a prototype, you can create 1 billion of them at basically zero marginal cost. Physical robots are not scalable in that same fashion, but they are scalable because of the machine needs, right? So if you wed AI with robots, you got autonomous agents, and that is scalable. And the country that has got the scale advantage right now is China. They have hundreds of thousands of firms using the AI development platforms of Baidu and others to develop applications, and many of those are going to be dual use. So the future of warfare will be on scalable applications, and that will include autonomous agents, and that I think will be the revolutionary aspect that will then be the determinative factor in outcomes. So kind of going back to what Amos was saying, at the end of the day, it may not be humans going out to root humans out of dugouts, but autonomous agents, and scale will matter.
all the more reason for Canada to get a lot more serious about investments in industrial development. And I know you have some thoughts on that, as you highlighted, Dan. I wish we had more time. We should have a show on that, frankly. Anyway, Rob, on to you.
Yeah, I'd say really my comments more relate to, Canada, what we can do at this pivotal point in time when our sovereignty is being challenged and in the context of the global security environment. And I'd say really when we look at the Chinese strategic approach to conflict, the civil military fusion construct and its Silk Road strategy, looking at how it asserts its influence strategically, there's much to learn for us. I would say when we look at ourselves as a nation and a military of modest means, what can we do really in terms of, one, assuring the integrity of our own sovereignty, and also ensuring that we have a meaningful place and ability to contribute internationally. And I'd say this is something that we start to look at, the development of emerging disruptive technologies, dual use technologies, where we have a significant a solid, significant base within to, one, serve to ensure the security of our critical infrastructure, our digital sovereignty, our strategic autonomy, and then as well contribute to future military capabilities. Now, that's all fair and good. We always have to be mindful that to ensure that we maintain a solid general purpose combat capability. What we've seen, notwithstanding the very innovative technologies that have been applied in Ukraine, it is still very much a land war. And to Amos's point, in terms of being able to capture and hold ground, that's a fundamental import. But, we have a heavy lift moving forward, and I'd say we need a balanced approach in terms of ensuring that we develop and maintain technological leadership to serve broader strategic interests, economic as well as geopolitical interests, and also general purpose military capability.
Fantastic. Thank you. Amos, last thoughts?
Yeah, just what I said earlier, we got to keep interoperability at the fore of our mind. It's I think we potentially could outstretch the alliance. If it continues to last going forward, I hope it does. But we can't. We being the U.S. have to be careful about pushing so far forward that our partners can't keep up economically or at the industrial capacity required to keep up with us, which in turn would create a seam that could be exploited by Russia, China, whomever. So there's that. The other thing too, again, robotics, everything that isn't a human being, they're terrific. They're great auxiliaries. They're great at doing additional stuff. But at the end of the day, I think especially a country like Russia or China, who show that they have very little interest in human life, much less robotic life, would happily throw human waves at the problem after all the robotics are destroyed. And so we can't put our hope in that robotics, AI, all these things are going to be, the philosopher's stone for the future of warfare, and that all we got to do is show up with these things and everybody's going to throw their hands up and be like, oh, we give up. You've got all these great weapons, right? At the end of the day, I think Russia and China would be more than happy to just keep feeding people at the problem until they accomplish their goal, or we, whomever the we happens to be in this situation, throw our hands up and say we're done. So that's it. Back to you, Daniel. Thank you.
Thanks, Amos. Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much for your insights and your time, and most importantly, writing these, I think, very thoughtful pieces. I hope the audience gleaned something from them. I did. And have a good evening.
That brings us to the end of the pod. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an update. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, Be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thank you for listening, and a big thank you once again to Daniel Araya, both for editing our recent On Track publication and for hosting this panel. Thanks, and we hope you'll be tuning in next time.